When did you come to Herculaneum?
I was born in Herculaneum and lived here most of my life.
And Mr. Herbert?
I was born in Herculaneum, December 19th, 1919, and went to school in Herculaneum.
Elmo, did you
No,
move to
I
Herculaneum?
was born in Washington County at Hopewell, Missouri. Moved to Herculaneum in 1929 and have lived here ever since.
And Sonny?
I was born in St. Louis and moved to Herculaneum in 1933. Memories of Herculaneum at that time are very vivid and still with me. And I might say that it was a very enjoyable time in life, having that opportunity to grow up here in Herculaneum.
Alright, this is...
Let's cut for a second.
Alright.
So I have to shut this door.
Where do you live in Herculaneum?
I originally lived on Dale Street. It's just south of Station Street in Herculaneum. And later on, I was moved up to Sherman Drive when I was moved because of the cleanups of Doe Run.
And do you still live here?
Beg pardon?
Do you still live here?
I still live here.
Eddie, where did you live at Herculaneum?
I lived on Dale Street in Herculaneum, lived there my first 19 years, and then I moved to Festus. I've been there ever since. So
You live in Festus right now?
I live in Festus now, been there since 1948.
Elmo, where do you live at Herculaneum?
I live out in what they used to call Crystal Heights. It's 570 Mississippi Drive in Herculaneum. And I've lived there since 1946.
Sonny, where did you live at Herculaneum?
I lived in the area that had been known as Reservoir Hill. It's on Old 6167 as you immediately come into Herculaneum from on the north. And much of Herculaneum didn't have street signs back at the time I grew up. In fact, we didn't know Herculaneum by any street. We knew where Concrete Town was, we knew where downtown was, we knew where the school was, we knew where Reservoir Hill was. This was the way we kept track of Herculaneum.
Do you still live here?
Pardon?
Do you still live in Herculaneum?
I lived here until about 1953, at which time it was necessary to move. Employment was not that great in the area, and I now live at Fenton. I've only lived there but 56 short years.
Thank you.
Lillie, who were your parents?
My father was William Edward Herbert, and he was born out in the Hematite area and moved into Festus, and then become employed by St. Joe Lead Company, and then moved into Herculaneum. And my mother was from the same area in Hematite, and her name was Laura Foster Herbert. And they lived for about 50 years in the house that I was born in.
And Mr. Herbert, who were your parents?
My parents were Mr. William Herbert too. Lillie's my sister, so
I see.
we have the same,
We got two in
same
one.
family.
Mr. Blum, who were your parents?
Edward Robert Blum and Molly L. Blum. My father was really from Washington County, and my mother was from San Francisco County. Anyway, they got together some way, and that's why I'm here.
Sonny, who were your parents?
My mother and father separated and divorced when I was about 4 years old. And at a time when I was 7 years old, my mother married a young man by the name of Elmo Blum. He was known as Time Blum. And I might say that I grew up here in Herculaneum associated with all of the Brumbaugh family. My last name is Eldridge, but many people know me because of the relationship within the Brumbaugh family. As I say, I left Herculaneum when, well, it was about 1953.
Lillie, how many generations of your family lived here?
Well, I figured it out, and we went back for 5 generations, starting with my dad and mother, then my family, which was 11 of us, and they had their children, which would have been my nieces and nephews, and I have great nieces and nephews, and we went down to 5 generations. The one family, the 5th generation, is the one family in our family.
Eddie, how many generations of your family lived here?
We've had 5 generations live here in Herculaneum.
Elmo, how about you?
Just 2 generations, my mother and father, and then my family and my children. One of them lives in DeSoto and one of them lives in Festus.
Sonny, how many generations of your family have lived here?
Many peoples involved in the Brumbaugh family. They were quite a large group, having had about 3 generations, maybe 4 generations of Brumbaughs that lived in the area. And counting back, oh, it was such a large family of them.
Lillie, for about how many years did you live in Herky?
I lived in Herculaneum all but 5 years of my life, and those 5 years were spent in Festus. I married and moved to Festus, and my husband and I both worked over in Crystal City. So after 5 years, my father ended up in the house by himself, so he and I and a brand new baby moved back to Herculaneum to live with him.
And Eddie, are you still in Herculaneum?
I left Herculaneum when I was 19 years old, been in Festus.
Okay,
Missouri
so how long
ever
did you live in
since.
Herky when you were here?
19 years in Festus and Herculaneum.
Okay. And Eddie, what about you?
I've lived here in Herculaneum for 77 years.
And Sonny?
I lived in Herculaneum for approximately 20 years.
Lillie, did you or your family work in Herculaneum?
My dad originally worked for Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, and he found out that the wages were higher in Herculaneum, so he moved to Herculaneum with his family, which was 1 child at that time, and they had been living in Festus. So when they moved to Herculaneum, and he retired when he was 65 years old, because they had the laws came into effect that they had to retire at age 65, which he very reluctantly had to do. And I had 3 brothers that also worked in St. Joe Lead Company. And then they moved on to other jobs.
Eddie, did you work in Herculaneum?
The only work that I did in Herculaneum was during my school years, where I worked in the grocery stores, sold newspapers and that type of thing. And that was my history of the work in Herculaneum.
How were the wages at the grocery store?
Well, $2 a week.
Elmo, did you or your family work in Herculaneum?
My father had a grocery store up on what's called Joachim Street now. It was the first business place as you came into town. It was a grocery store and service station combined. It was Sinclair service station. And of course it had the old type pumps that you pumped up 10 gallon in the top of the pump and then drained it back down to sell gasoline. And we had to work in the grocery store business with him. We had my brother and I. And incidentally, I have a twin brother. He's not near good looking as me, but anyway. But anyway, we took orders and delivered groceries. We'd go take an order and then we'd go back, fill the order, and take it back to the person and hopefully collect the money. And sometimes we did, and sometimes we didn't. And then we had other part-time jobs too. We'd have about 25 rabbit traps out, and we'd run them every morning in the wintertime. And what rabbits we caught, we'd come back and clean them and put them in the meat case, and we'd sell them. We'd get 25 cents a piece for them. So we did that. And anyway, we raised pigs on the side, my brother and I. And we'd butcher them and then put them in the meat case too, because you didn't have to have inspections and all at that time. So that's how we got rid of them. And we had goats too. We had a couple of goats, and they got where they'd come in the house without being invited, and my mother said, "You got to do something about them goats." So we took them out in the back and chopped their heads off and put them in the meat case and sold them for beef, and nobody ever knew the difference.
Sonny, did you or your family work in Herculaneum?
No, my stepfather worked at Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company, and while Elmo gave mention of his background of life in Herculaneum when he was growing up, I lived next door to the Blum family. They didn't stay too long after we moved in, though. They had to leave about 2 or 3 years. And I might say that almost everyone in Herculaneum, you were very self-serving. You raised a garden. He made mention that they raised pigs. Our living on the edge of town, we too raised a couple of hogs every year. You had chickens. You did set box traps. You did go rabbit hunting, and all of the things that he's touched on. This is very similar to life in Herculaneum, all the rest of the population.
One of you had mentioned going to school in Herculaneum. Did you, Lillie?
Yes.
Did you? What was it like? Who were your teachers? And
Well, I have a long list of them. And what, you want to hear the whole list?
Maybe not.
Okay.
What were your teachers like?
Well, much different than it is now, because the teachers were, I guess, what you would call old-fashioned, what we would think of people nowadays. And the dress codes were very strict, and the teachers were very strict. Spanking was a rule, and either little spankings on the legs or paddles on your hand. And the dress, along with the dress code, one thing I will never forget was the first girl in about the 2nd or 3rd grade wore bobby socks to school, and she got a spanking for wearing bobby socks to school. That wasn't acceptable. So that's how strict it was. And you didn't see slacks on girls or shorts, definitely not. And the teachers were very kind, and I felt like the children who needed more help or more support, or were didn't have as much to do with as far as projects, the teachers helped them out were very helpful to the students. And I recall one year I was in a play, and I had to be provided with a costume, so one of the teachers made a costume for me, and then loaned me her shoes to wear, because I didn't have the proper shoes.
Which one was that?
Her name was Mrs. Marlowe.
Mrs. Marlowe.
And she was a teacher for the domestic classes.
Let's see. What were some of your other favorites?
My math teacher was a man, which he was very, very kind, and he seemed to take a liking to me when I was in like the 5th grade, and he was very helpful to me. And in helping them enjoy school, to have teachers they were very, very understanding and helpful to the students.
Do you remember his name?
I might be able to find it offhand. Mr. Lovell.
And Eddie, what was school like in Herky for you?
Well, I've got a lot of very fond memories of Herculaneum. Most of it's from the school. I had a lot of wonderful teachers. I was always pretty busy working when I was going to school, and they all maybe let me take a little nap during class, and they never interrupted me. So I had lots of good times in Herculaneum, especially like their school carnivals and that type of thing. I had a lot of wonderful teachers.
Since you worked, did you ever do any sports?
Most of my sports activities were on the track field.
Did you specialize in anything?
The long distance runs was my specialties. I don't think I ever won one of them, but that's what I like doing.
A for effort, right? And Elmo, did you go to school in Herky?
Yes, I did.
What was it like?
Yeah, it was probably different than what it is today. Of course, we lived up on the hill. There were no school buses, so we had to walk. Well, we ran to school and ran back to both ways. What do I remember about school? Well, remember a few fights I got into. One of them I won. I remember later on as I was in track and I held 440-yard dash run for 3 or 4 years or so, or something or other. I was active in basketball. I played basketball here for 3 years. And academically, I didn't really do all that well academically. You know, they just kind of wanted to get rid of me. One of those situations, you know. So anyway, I got out. And they was glad to graduate me.
I see. And Sonny, what about you?
I started school the 2nd grade, and we had a teacher by the name of Miss Heiner. Now I'm going to use names like Miss because there was no married teachers. Once a teacher chose to get married, she had to leave the teaching profession. So my first remembrance of the teachers in Herculaneum, Miss Heiner taught the 2nd and followed us to the 3rd grade, at which time Miss Toomey picked us up, and she taught us the 4th and 5th grade. We also had a substitute teacher and a Miss Craft on occasions. A Mrs. Craft, she was a substitute teacher. A Mrs. Thomas, she was a substitute teacher. We had a Miss Caston. We had a Sadie Morris, who was supposed to have been a descendant from the Mr. Morris who invented the Morris Code, and she was very interesting, very sweet, very small individual. The first gentleman that we had as an instructor was a Mr. Horine, and he was an ex-highway patrolman. And he was very strict and very rigid in his discipline. No one ever was harmed by his discipline, but you showed him a certain amount of respect because you knew that he could administer. At any rate, going into high school, we had a number of fabulous teachers, among which I would like to make mention a Daphne Crawford. Daphne it had been boasted that she could speak 7 different languages. As a mathematician, she was fabulous. She could keep your attention in a class, she would open the book to the certain page that we were supposed to be studying for, and she would take off her glasses. The book would be open. She would sit and hold her eyes and verbatim repeat everything that was on that page, and we would sit there glued, watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. She never did. In history, we had Miss Robinson. We had a Miss Reese. But one of the more outstanding educators was a Mr. Taylor, who was superintendent of the operation. And Mr. Taylor would happen in at no given time, but he did tour the school all during the sessions, and he could come into your class and he would listen and watch, and seldom did he ever add anything, but he was in tune with what was happening. He was talking about sports, and Elmo made mention that he had ran track. Well, back during the 30s, that was the time that they built the track field. And prior to that, they did have a basketball team. They did play a little bit of softball. After the 30s, in the late 30s, yes, they had track and they had basketball. And I might say that Herculaneum did boast of several teams that made it all the way to state. There used to be a number of trophies that dated back to that time. They may have been destroyed in the fire.
I think we still have some.
Lillie and Eddie, did you two attend church back in high school?
I'll answer first.
Go ahead.
We were members of the Herculaneum Baptist Church from, I guess, the day of our birth, practically. And I was in the Baptist Church in Herculaneum until I was married. My husband was a Methodist, so we moved to Festus, and I went to the Methodist Church then. And when I moved back to Herculaneum, when my children were born, we joined the Methodist Church in Herculaneum.
Eddie, what about you?
Well, we have a lot of fond memories of the Herculaneum Baptist Church, because that's when we were young kids running around. We always went up to church, and that's when they built the new church down there, which was, I don't know what year, but we'd go up there every day after work hours, and work on that church, and we had lots of fun down there. But that's when they were down, I guess you'd call Old Town. That's when Baptist Church was there.
Elmo, did you attend church?
Yeah, I attended Herculaneum Baptist Church also, and we. I remember when that was just a little one-room church house, and then I think it was under the direction of Claude Leonard, Senior, that is, and they jacked that building up and made an extension there and put a basement under all that. And I remember all those ties, he used cross ties, as he stacked that up. And I'm like Eddie, of course I'm not near as young, I'm not near as old as Eddie, so, but I can still remember that church setting up on those blocks with ties.
Sonny, what about you?
We went to the Methodist Church, and as best I can remember, the church has grown, but it does still take on a lot of the structure that it was even back during the time of the 30s and the 40s. It was a smaller congregation than what we have today in our churches, and you were very well acquainted with everyone. And all that I could say that church life in Herculaneum, there was 4 churches, and I went to the Little Methodist Church. That's the extent of that.
Lillie, Did you belong to any civic or social clubs?
Well, the one that I enjoyed the most, Hilda Kaufman, who was a school teacher here at one time, and she was also went to the same church I did and belonged to the ladies' circle in that church. So we formed a club of craft. We called it a craft club, that we made items to sell at our church dinner and craft show. And we made enough. There was about 10 in a group, and we went one day every week, and she sent us home with a project to finish. So it took about the whole week to finish the project that she sent us home with. When we sold all of these lovely craft products we made, and we earned about $3,000 off of our chicken dumpling dinner and the craft show that we had. And that was one of my really favorite things to do. And then I belonged to a ladies' club that we played cards, and we could have parties, and we would have a night out sometime, just the ladies by themselves. And we stayed organized, I guess, for about 15 years, and they floated away to married and going to different towns, living in different areas. So we did finally dissolved.
Eddie, what about you?
Well, I guess the only clubs or things I belonged to here was the Boy Scouts. We had a lot of Boy Scout activity. Other than that, we didn't have many things going other than church activities. That was about it.
And Elmo, were you in any clubs of any kind?
Well, I belonged to Boy Scouts at one time, and that was about it. That's about the only thing there was.
For the boys?
Church activities or Boy Scouts.
I see. Sonny?
I started off, yes, in the Boy Scouts. I made it as far as the star, and I had to give that up. I got busy in other areas. I had joined a little boxing team that's here in town. It was headed up by a Times Leonard and a Mr. Carr, and we ran all over the various little hamlets in the Lead Belt, and it was an experience. Also, though, they promoted that we should go to the Golden Gloves. Fine. Well, I made it to 3 different layers as a 140-pound boxer, but I didn't go out at the top. I didn't. I got right next to the top, but I didn't win. So that is that. But I was involved in the school band. We had an excellent school band. We had an instructor by the name of Mr. Fitty, and we all admired him and worked terribly hard for him. He could play any instrument that we had, and if you had a passage that you was having complications with, he could come over, he could pick up the horn, he would play it for you. From that, we had a school band that was very astute, and we would go to Cape, and we would place in the scholastics at Cape. And let's see, among all of the other things, though, that I was involved in, I had wanted to be an industrial arts teacher. And I had become very infatuated with the shop and with the mechanical drawing and things of that nature. Upon graduating from high school, financially, most people in Herculaneum were not financially able that we as youngsters could go on to college. From there, the activities that I took on was that I had to give up a lot of what was going on in Herculaneum. Herculaneum will always be home now, but you do have to get out and spread yourself thin and see some of the rest of the world. I played in this little orchestra for a number of years. We played such places as Artesian Park. We played in the Festus area. We played up in the Barnhart, Kimmswick area. And I was not that great of an athlete in that I was too clumsy to play basketball, but I could fight. But that's the extent of the activities that I was involved in, other than going to school, going to church. There was 3 major things that was in our lives at that time. It was home, church, and school, and that's what you occupied yourself doing. Herculaneum was without telephones, but you knew if you was over in the far edges of town, if you did something that you shouldn't, you better get home and tell it quick, because word would get there before you did. So yes, it was a wonderful experience and a wonderful time.
Lillie, do you remember any town holiday celebrations?
One of the bigger celebrations we had was when they had the 175th anniversary of the settlement of Herculaneum. And they had a lot of carnivals came in. We had a carnival that came into town. And there was activities that went on. Would be a dance someplace. Would be holding a dance for the adults. The children had games that they could play. And this was mostly carried on during the summertime. And we had a field down on the other side of the bridge, which is now almost out to the highway, that they had games to play, baseball games. And let's see, I was thinking, celebrations. You were talking about that's about all I remember.
Hey, can you remember any other town celebrations?
In the mid-30s, I guess it was, we had a ferry boat celebration. I guess you've heard of the ferry that we had to get you across the Mississippi. I can remember that fair. I know I sold popcorn. I was working for Honey Domar, one of our druggists here in town, and I remember I sold $22 worth of popcorn, a nickel a bag, and that's a lot of popcorn. That's really the one big affair that I remember we had.
Elmo, do you remember any?
I really don't remember too many celebrations, but I do remember this. Nearly every Saturday night, there would be some house here in Herculaneum, and I remember the West Buckner house and the Joe DeClue, and they'd have these dances, and they'd have a fiddle and a banjo and a guitar or so and something like that. And I was kind of small, but I remember going to those houses and looking in the doors, looking in the windows and watching them dancing there, and they just put everything back. And like in the living room, push everything back and going, they could fiddle and play and dance, and we enjoyed watching them do that. It was most of the older people that did that.
Sonny, can you remember any town celebrations?
At school, they had started a program where the seniors would be going on a senior tour, a senior trip upon graduating. And during the time that you were in school, you were encouraged to be involved in certain money-raising programs. But the thing that was of greatest importance was each year there was a picnic or a homecoming held on the school grounds. And it was a time when you got to rub elbows with old friends, and I'd get to see Blum once in a while. And among the various things that comes out in my mind, that was a major one.
In your time in Herculaneum, do you remember any floods or any other disasters of any type?
Well, I think the one that's in my mind and most important was when the school burned. It was in Christmas Day in 1927. No, I'm sorry, that's the wrong date. Well, it was on Christmas Day in 1947, the school burned. And the students had to go to have classes in church basements or down Masonic Temple. They had classes. And they were scattered all over town. They had all the children in the school had to go someplace else to school, which was very difficult for the whole year because they were a long time getting back. Things settled back so they could go back to their school classes. And then in 1927 there was a tornado went through Herculaneum, and was our downtown area, which was all brick buildings. It was a whole block of a continuous brick building, and on the southern half of the buildings, all the fronts were blown out, and the bricks were all laying down on the ground. So a lot of trees were destroyed, but I don't think there was many homes. It just seemed like it took a path through that area and destroyed a lot of the downtown area. But a lot of it was built back up, and of course, along with building back up, there was some improvements made, and the town looked better. And then the flood that we had, of course, the big flood in 1983, we had the big flood, and both bridges on both highways was closed, and we had to drive all the way over to Interstate 55 to get over to Festus. And that lasted all summer long. We had a problem with the flooding that we had that year.
Eddie, do you remember anything in
I
particular?
don't remember anything bad happening in Herculaneum. Of course, I wasn't there all that many years.
Good to have fun memories. And Elmo, what about you?
Anything bad?
Any disasters, floods,
Any disasters?
fires?
No, I really don't remember anything really disasters. There probably were some, but I probably had other things to do.
I see.
Didn't pay attention to them.
Gotcha. And Sonny, what about you?
Well, the only disaster that I recall, and it was a severe one, was when the school burned. I came down the highway and was part of the troops that stood and observed. That it was a very hectic time. And, but that is the only disaster that I recall.
Let's see.
Lillie, do you remember anything or any activities down at the river?
Well, one of the fun things I found out on a Sunday afternoon would be kind of a lonesome day if you didn't have something to do. So we did a lot of walking around through the town. But the ferry boat was in operation down there all summer long, and I don't know how many years it was there. But you could walk down there, and we would go down there, a group of children would go down there, and when the cars were getting on the ferry boat to go over to Illinois, they would let the children get on the boat too, on the ferry boat too, and we would ride for nothing. We'd get over there, and when they had a trip to come back to bring cars back from Illinois to Herculaneum, we would ride back to Herculaneum. So that was a fun day for us to get to do that. And then showboats used to come down and dock down there close to the ferry landing. And on the showboats they would have vaudevilles, and sometimes they would have an orchestra and have dances on the boats. And I guess that was about. We would often be down at the riverfront. You might see a steamboat go up and down the river, which was fun to watch and hear the music playing from the boats. We enjoyed that.
Eddie, do you remember anything down the river?
Well, all I remember mainly is the ferry. We'd go across the river on the ferry and walk about 2 miles over, walking east, and there was a town over there. I couldn't even tell you what the name of it is, but we'd go across the river on a ferry and go over, walk over 2 miles to Vandalia or whatever it was.
Vandalia.
Is that what it was? And that would be our day. That was up there in back of Dennis's house. That's where the ferry was.
Elmo, do you remember anything down the river?
Well, I remember the ferry too. It seemed to me like nearly the whole town would go out and ride that ferry across the river, back and forth. And the other thing is, there was a lot of foot traffic up and down on the railroad tracks where people would walk between Crystal City and Herculaneum. That was the thing to do on a Sunday afternoon. But there was always, it never seemed like there was anything where we didn't have something to do. There was always something to do, and we were always busy. I think it's changed a little today. You know, so many people, well, they don't have anything to do. Well, we never had a lack of anything to do.
Sonny, what about you?
Really, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn didn't have anything on the youngsters in Herculaneum when it came to the river. Yes, there was many of us that remember riding that ferry, but they didn't make mention that we were all so young that we did not have a wristwatch. We didn't know what time it was. Now we're talking about in the summertime, during vacation time. But we did have a whistle that blew at 4 o'clock down here at St. Joe Lead Company. So we would make an arrangement with the operator of the ferry. We'd go over to Illinois and we'd mosey around up and down that side of the river. But we always knew, you better be back and you better get on that ferry at 4 o'clock. He would threaten to leave us. He never left anyone, but we would struggle to get back. And we heard the whistle blow, we'd come running. The river, yes, there used to be a commercial fisherman by the name of Bud Griffin. And Bud Griffin operated a location that was between the lead company and the river. And at that location, he would build the boats that he used out on the river. He also would repair and fabricate and make the various necessaries on his traps that he used in the river. And us boys used to go down and spend a lot of time with Bud Griffin down there. And you should have seen some of the large spoonbill catfish that he had caught in the river. I've seen catfish. Today I don't know how large, but I know that to me, being a youngster, this booger, he was way larger than I was. He'd have him hanging up. But of course it had a 2-foot snout out on the front, a spoonbill does. There's a cave that's just on the other side of the Joachim Creek. And just among us youngsters, we used to always refer to it as Jesse James's Cave. We all went down and rummaged in Jesse James's cave. Let's move back to where the Joachim Creek empties out into the Mississippi. Let's just go as far as the trestle. Many times on Sunday afternoon, it was great sport to take a rifle and throw a piece of bread out in the water, and when the gar came up, you'd shoot him. Well, with that, you would have an abundance of gars. You had 200 or 300 that would show up. You know, they were carnivorous. So, yes, the river. There was an awful lot of crows that flew from Illinois over to Herculaneum. And those of us boys that had reached a time that we were permitted to use a shotgun, we'd go sit under the willows down there and wait for the crows to come over. It was an experience that was painful in many respects because you would be shooting a gun. I was shooting a 12 gauge and I'd shoot a half box of shells and I'd be bruised from my elbow all the way to the middle of my chest for a week. You couldn't stand to do this too often. So the river, it was an important facet of our time and our fun time. And, it's got a lot of fond memories.
Back to you, Lily. What were things like in Herculaneum during World War II and the Depression?
Well, finding something to keep yourself entertained with was very difficult.
Your attention, please. You can go to the auditorium now for the concert. Thank you.
Go ahead and start over.
Okay. It was difficult to find something, some entertainment at that time, and of course you didn't have much money to spend either, but one thing that we really enjoyed, St. Joe Lead Company built a bowling alley downtown for the city, for the people in Herculaneum. And when it was built, they formed teams. So we had women's teams, a group of women's teams, and the men had their teams of the bowlers. And the women played between themselves until they found out which team ended up being the champion team, the same as the men did. And that bowling alley was run by a neighbor of mine, Pete and Ellen Baker. And they would take care of it, clean it up, keep it cleaned up, and then we'd go down and every night and open the bowling alley and stay till it was closed. And the young boys in the neighborhood or in that area in Herky would be the pin setters, and sometimes they would just set the pins for free just to get to bowl, and other times they might get paid 25 cents to set the pins that night because they didn't have automatic pin setters. And Sunday afternoon we did a lot of walking too. I was in one of the groups that we walked the railroad tracks. We would go across the bridge, across the train bridge, walk down to the bluff, climb the bluffs, and walk through the bluffs. And sometimes I found it easier to climb the bluff than it was to climb back down. And that was scary, climbing back down. And I remember I did peek into the cave, but I didn't go take more than 2 steps in there because I was afraid of the cave. Because I was afraid what might be in that cave. And we did have a lot of times we walked north up to Peevely, to the train station. A train went through there certain times in the evening. We sat on a big rock wall along the tracks. And we sat on that wall and watched the trains go by, which was a treat. And let's see. In the wintertime, sleigh riding was a big thing for us. There was a steep hill behind the Catholic church, and you'd go down that hill, sleigh riding. And then sometimes we'd go out to the golf course, and they would let us sleigh ride out there, but later on they stopped that. But I remember the time I was out there sleigh riding, and my 2 kids were on my back, laying on my back. I was on the bottom of the sled, and they were on my back, and I got out from under that sled. I was bruised solid on my legs down there, and I had those bruises for a long time, having those two kids on my back, going down that hill. And let's see. Well, as youngsters, we had the streets to play in, and we played ball in the streets. We played kick the can, hide and go seek, and we'd hide behind people's bushes up and down the street. And the yards were open, the area was open to the whole neighborhood. So the neighborhood children gathered almost every evening and would be outside until dark. At dark, while you went in, cleaned up the separate dishes if you hadn't done it already, and then get your bath and go to bed. So that was the way our time was spent.
That's sweet. And Eddie, do you remember what life was like during this time?
Well, I think one of our big things, we had a school carnival every year. That was one of our big things when we were growing up. In fact, that's where I met my wife. And we started dating. 61 years later, I still have her.
Wow.
Or 65.
Yeah.
Another thing we used to do is every year we'd have a train go to Poplar Bluff. That was an annual affair to get on an excursion train and go to Poplar Bluff. And of course we went to the movies. We had the movies every night. Go see the Cowboys. That was about it.
Emma, what was life like for you here in Herky during the Depression?
Well, I remember the ice skating that Lillie had mentioned. The creek would usually freeze over in December down here, and we'd build big bonfires. It seemed to me like half of the town would come out, and there were some pretty good skaters. I remember Turk Thomas; he was a pretty good skater, and but what the kind of skates we had is you had a key and you fastened them on your shoe. They didn't have shoe skates like they have today. But we had a lot of fun in the winter times with skating down on the creek. Right there by the bridge is where we'd go. I know some of us sometimes would see how far we could go up the creek, and sometimes the ice would start cracking, and of course we'd hurry back because it seemed like it was more solid down around the bridge than it was on up the creek a little bit farther. And then we had the movies. Of course, we didn't have, it was all black and white when we went. I have seen some silent movies there. Probably Eddie and Lillie saw a lot of them. Of the silent movies.
Hey now.
Eddie's about 3 or 4 years older than me, and Lillie's about 6 years older, I guess. So, but things were happening rather rapidly along about those times in technology. But anyway, I don't remember what it cost to see a movie. I think it was either a nickel or a dime. Do you remember, Eddie?
10 cents.
10 cents, okay. That's when we had to pay. Sometimes we'd get in for nothing. If you knew the right people, you could get in for nothing. They'd say, go on in, you know. If you stood outside long enough, somebody'd feel sorry for you, and so you'd get to go in.
And Sonny, what about you?
I'd like to pick up where Elmo left off there. Elmo had an uncle that owned that store, or not store, that show. His name was Bob Evans. And yes, Saturday night was the place to be. You went to the show there. I recall that I would work for a lady in the neighborhood, moving all of the ashes or doing anything necessary. She'd get 8 hours out of me for a quarter. But if I had that quarter, I could go to the show. Next door to the show was a bakery shop, and they carried a line of candies. We could run in, get a nickel's worth of candy that we'd all squabble over. But then after the show, we would go around to the back door of this bakery, which was next to the show, knock on the door, and Mr. Knocky, who was the baker, would come to the door, and for that dime we could buy a loaf of hot bread. And you know, there's 5 or 6 of us always in this group, and we could break off pieces of this hot bread. So going to the show was an experience for us for a Saturday night. Now, if you're talking about fun in Herculaneum back in the wintertime, yes, there was ice skating on the creek, which many of us participated in. And then there was sleigh riding. And Herculaneum at that time, we were a segregated school system. And we had a section of town that was known as Colored Town, and that was where the colored folks lived. Now, we got along 100%. And the youngsters, we all mixed back and forth. And in the wintertime, there's a hill that is over there in the section of Colored Town that runs parallel to the creek. And if you wanted to really enjoy sleigh riding, that was the place you went. But now, we all intermingled and we all got along so very well with the colored people, and they with us. There's many stories that had come out of that time that at another time would be very interesting.
Lillie, what businesses do you remember in town?
Okay. There was a shoe shop downtown. Mr. Guichardo ran the shoe shop. It was a little hotel. It was a brick building. It sat on the east side of the street, and it was run by Jenny Denton. And the 2 drugstores. One of them, the owner of the drugstore, I don't know what his real name was, but he's known to us. He was Honey Domar. His nickname was Honey. He's Honey Domar. And in that drugstore, we had a fountain, and the fountain was the biggest attraction to us. You had big ice cream cones or ice cream sundaes, big ice cream sundae for 10 cents, ice cream sodas, and candy. It had candy and any element that you would. On Valentine's Day, there'd be a whole big rack of Valentines where you could shop. So we shopped a lot at that drugstore. And across the street from that drugstore was another drugstore run by a man called Dr. Wood. But it wasn't as big a store. And in later years, it turned into a variety store. And a man by the name of Guy Barnwell run the store. And he had like a candies, a fountain with the sodas and ice cream, and sometimes on the shelf by him was setting a slot machine. He didn't leave it there all the time, but that slot machine sat there once in a while because slot machines were not legal then. And I remember being in there once, and I put a nickel in that slot machine. I got 3 back, and I didn't put them back in. So. So I had 3 nickels out of his slot machine. And, okay. We had a cleaners down there. His name was J.V. Carl. And a lumber yard, a barber shop. The company store was originally was run by St. Joe, and in later years it was bought back from St. Joe. They bought Jim House and Lava Brewer bought the store, and they operated the store there for the town, and it had carried a little bit of everything, groceries, and you could buy yard goods, underclothes, dress material, laces, and there's just a variety of things that you could buy there also besides grocery stores. And then later on they built a store down on the highway, and Jim House and his wife operated it as a grocery store for Herculaneum. And when they left town, then we were left without a grocery store. With the baker shop on the hill was mentioned, and we had a general store was run. In fact, we had 2 stores in town that belonged to Jewish people. The general store downtown had all kinds of clothing, and it was Mr. Wax ran that store, and he lived down in that area. And then up on the hill above where the baker shop and the theater was, there was 2 stores, and they were operated by people called Mr. Levy. There was two brothers. One of them had a grocery store, and the other one had a merchandise of almost anything you want to buy. There was a service station and an automobile dealer store there, as Mr. John Dubin had, right there next to the grocery stores. And of course we had the movies. That's about it, as I remember.
Eddie, what businesses do you remember in town?
Well, I can remember one time we had a bank in Herculaneum. I don't know what year that was, but later on Mr. Rapp took over that building, and he had an insurance agency there. That was in the main building where Mr. Domar had his drugstore, and there was a couple of taverns in that area. Herculaneum never had a shortage of taverns. I think it's all the ones I remember.
What about you? Which ones do you remember?
Well, I remember, I think it was around 1937, my dad sold his grocery store, and he bought a service station downtown, and it was right next to where St. Joe Lead Company is now, to the east side, and in back of it was Braden Rushing's coal yard. He sold coal to all of the people in town, just about. He had a service station. He had a service station there and a garage. And the garage was operated by, well, he was employed by, my dad was a colored man, and his name was Jim Harris. Jim Harris, I'm pretty sure that's what his name was. But he was one of the nicest guys I think I ever met. In fact, Sonny here had mentioned something about the colored situation here in town. You know, everybody got along real well. Really, my brother and I, our best friend was a little colored guy. He spent more time in our house than he spent at home, I think, and his name was Mutt. And I forget what his last name was, but anyway, he was a little bitty guy, and we had a lot of fun with him. But anyway, then I remember next to the garage there, Mr. Harris really run, was Wax's clothing store. And Mars Wax and Leo Wax run that, his son. And then next to that was the post office. And then you went down about 3 steps. This is all on the east side there. And there was a butcher shop there. I believe that was Butcher Lou's butcher shop. And next to that was a shoe store. And then Guy Barneswell, next to that, he had that variety store. We converted that over to a tavern. He thought that was more profitable that way, you know. And I remember his wife had a little dog, and his name was Jiggs. And Jiggs was always up there around there petting. We was always messing around with him. Anyway, Jiggs was up there one day, and we picked up a skunk that somebody hit in the road. And brother and I decided we'd just get that skunk and rub that skunk all over that little old dog Jiggs, which we did. And guy come up there, and he was telling my dad, "You're going to have to do something about them boys," said, because somebody rubbed skunk juice all over that dog. The more Trish scrubbed, the worse he stunk. And, but anyway, we never did admit to it, but he had it pretty well zeroed in on it. But anyway, we're talking about businesses. That just a little side information. The next to that was a company store. And at that time, we had moved from up on the hill, and we lived on the second floor of a building there, and underneath it, my dad had an appliance store. And I remember Norge Products was one of the big ones that he had there. And then right to the south of us was J.V. Carl's cleaning shop, and he had that in the bottom floor, and he lived upstairs, and he cleaned everything with white gasoline, and you could smell that gasoline nearly all the time, you know. And the people, I think, when they had their clothes cleaned, they had to leave them hang out on the line so that gas would evaporate from them. But anyway, then they had the hotel still on the east side. I'm jumping across the street there. But anyway, they had the hotel there, and I remember Swaby lived over. Remember Swaby? And what was the big guy's name? I forget.
Swede, they call him the Swede.
Yeah. Anyway, they lived in that hotel, and they worked there at St. Joe Lead. And then down at the end of the street was what they call the KP Hall, and that's where the Masons met too. And underneath that KP Hall, Reaver had a printing shop, and he published a paper down there too. And then if we circled on back and came up, started back north again on the west side of the street, there was that lumber yard, and then it became a Fex furniture store was there. And then there was a gap in there was no continuation of that building, and then that's where J.V. Carl and then our place, and then next to that was Butch Rapp. It used to be a bank, and he had an insurance office in there then. And coming down, he had Preacher White's Tavern. Remember that one? Mm-hmm. And then next to that was Stafford's Tavern. He had I believe his name was Stafford. Had a tavern in there, and I think later on they made a bowling alley out of that. But I remember the tavern there in particular, you know. And then on down the line, you got Honey Domar's drugstore, And I don't remember what was in that corner building, but it was a union hall. And I don't know if that was there or not. My memory failed me there. But anyway, then across the street there, in back of those buildings was Bus Donnelly's barber shop, and C.C. Watts's grocery store. And then next to that, well, Dr. Hensley lived there.
On the corner.
On the corner there. And he had an iron fence around it. And I remember Dr. Hensley, he stood out there on the street a lot of times with his hands in his pockets. And he was kind of a heavy-set fella, you know. And he'd walk over across the street there and talk to us. And
Smoke those cigars.
Smoke those cigars, yeah. That's right. Mm-hmm. Then Dr. Sin came to town. But then when we get up on the hill there, like Lillie was saying, we had the show, the theater was right on the corner there, and then you had the bakery shop. And oh boy, we did, you know, a couple times a week we'd go in there as kids, and you could buy a loaf of bread for a nickel. And I'd get a stick of butter from my dad, you know, and we'd take that stick of butter and open that bread and put it in there, and that was really good eating, you know. And Mr. Knockie'd always throws in a couple of donuts and all too. And then J.W. Dugan's Dodge and Plymouth Agency. Incidentally, we used to take those, we'd always get us an old car.
That's Dodge, DeSoto, Plymouth, and Chrysler.
Okay, all right. We would get us, on Halloween, we'd get one of his old cars that he had parked out there along in the road there, Dugan's, you know. And nearly every Halloween, we'd take it down, we'd set it in front of the company store, right up next to the door where nobody could get in. And then he'd have to go and get somebody to take that down the next morning. But Mr. Dugan, he went along with us pretty well. But other things, we usually did that on the latter part. But usually on Halloween, why we turned over toilets. That was our main thing. That didn't have anything, we didn't get paid for that. I remember one time, we took one of the toilets from up here on Joachim Street now, and brought it down here and set it over the fountain of the school. And Mr. Taylor, the next morning, he come in, somebody must have snitched, you know, and he come in the classroom and he opened that door and he said, "Elmer and Elmo, come here." We got up there and he said, "I want you to take that back to where you got it and put it up for them people. And I want you to do it now." I said, "We can't do that, we're in a test." And he said, "Don't worry about that test, take care of that." So anyway, we did that, and when we was carrying it out, while a lot of kids was leaning out the windows, and they was laughing and hollering at us, and anyway, we had to take them back. How did I get onto that? But anyway, up next to Mr. Dugan's automobile agency, then there was Lillie already covered that. There was a grocery store and there was a clothing store. Those were owned by Taman Levy and what was the other Levy's name? Anyway, they were brothers. And they lived in that, just we went a little bit further north, there was a big 2-story house there, and they lived in that house there. And I remember those boys went to school, and they were about my age, and they wore knickers. And we thought that was kind of strange, you know, because the rest of us wore long pants, but they always wore knickers. If you don't know what knickers are, you know, they come down to your knees, and you wear soft. I've rambled on too much.
Sonny, what about you?
You want to remember some of the businesses in Herculaneum. Let's come on up the street from where he left off. At various times there would be pool halls, there would be taverns. Also, though, there was a barber shop. And do realize that most all of the peoples that traversed Main Street, you walked. And there was a sidewalk in front of those buildings. At any rate, there was 2 barber shops in town. Buster Donnelly down in the section that Brother Blum just defined, and a Push Williams of the Williams family. And I remember as a kid, we would be going by, and if business had gotten to where it was slow, many times Push would be standing out in front of his barber shop. And all of us kids, in the summertime, all you wore was a pair of overalls, that's all. He'd be standing out there, and he'd reach out and he'd grab whoever it was that had more hair than he should. He'd say, "Get in here," and he's such a gruff talking individual. I know that if everyone in Herculaneum back at that time would have paid up the barbershop fee, he cut every kid's hair in Herculaneum. He'd say, "I'll get it from your dad." "That's all right, your dad can pay me." And everything was done just per verbal. And I know that Mr. Push Williams, many times he was short of money, but the whole town was that way at that time. Going back, let's talk about this Dugan, the Dodge, DeSoto, Plymouth, and Chrysler. It was one of the first automobile agencies in Jefferson County for that particular brand of vehicles. And the Dugans lived up in the edge of town where Blum and I had grew up. And I worked for this Miss Dugan. She was the lady that would get 8 hours work out of a 25-cent piece with me. But I also had the opportunity to get acquainted with the Dugan family that had owned that agency. And Mr. Dugan was a very influential individual in the county. He was some sort of a federal agent. He also was involved at the building of the track field down here with the WPA that built this. This was a hand-built job, as we had discussed a moment ago. Mr. Dugan was a very quiet, very professional individual. I never did see him when he didn't have on a suit. As the years went by, the agency wanted, and it moved then finally to Festus, Crystal City, and it is currently owned by the Ogles, Sammy Ogle. But its infancy of starting was here in Herculaneum. And no one mentioned any of the Lupkes. The Lupkes had a store down in the same section of town that Blum just ran through, but he was back in a building that was behind where Dr. Sim would have been, not Dr. Hensley. Anyway, Homer operated a grocery store, but he made home deliveries. He had a little panel truck, and he would employ a young man to make deliveries, and Homer would stay and fill orders. Now this all came about though after the telephone came into being. Homer could stay there and take his orders over the telephone, fill them, and then get them delivered. A little further on, over toward the section of Colored Town, the Lupke family operated a truck line that distributed, well, it would be supplies and groceries to the various stores down through the lead belt. And Brother Blum and I had the opportunity to know a Bud Barrett who had married into the family, and Bud was one of the drivers of the trucks that distributed those goods. And this ran all the way up until it was in the 40s, late 40s, before they gave up. It may have even been later than that. That's as far as I remember on it. Businesses. There used to be a shoe factory in Herculaneum. I remember having seen remnants of the old building, but it was closed at the time of my memory. No one touched on the various little confectionaries that we had in different locations. Yes, we had Blum. It was a grocery store confectionery that was up on the far end of town, but we also had Puss Terry's, and that was right behind DeClue's Tavern, 2 or 3 doors up from that. But DeClue's Tavern, it was down here very close to the school system. That's just across the highway here from the high school. And we had, besides the DeClue's Tavern, we had a little place known as Mary Lou's. Now Mary Lou, everyone in town knew Mary Lou. She, in later years, Pug Moppin, after coming back from service, he married her, and Pug was a hard worker. He jumped in and dug a basement under the little tavern that they owned, and he put in a pool hall. And he became very proficient at playing pool. Everyone, if you had any spare time, any of the boys, we'd go down, we'd sit down in the pool hall, and we'd look and listen. You didn't get in the way, you didn't disturb the game, because sometimes there was money that was invested. Puss Terry's, I recall it was a favorite haunt of the boys. On our way to going crawfishing, we would stop in at Puss Terry's, and before going in, sometimes there'd be 4 or 5 of us, and we'd collect all the pennies that we had, and we'd go in and bargain with the Puss Terry's, Mr. or Mrs., and we'd buy a piece of liver. We'd ask, would you cut it up into the pieces necessary for each one of us to have a piece? We're going down here to go crawfishing. Yes. And when you wrap that up, would you put a couple extra wraps of string on there? Because that's what we were going to be using as line when we were doing our crawfishing. Let's see, you go on down the highway, and before you get to the creek, there was a filling station, and I don't know what all that he did not carry. It was known as the Green Lantern, and the building is still there. But the Green Lantern, I know that there's times you could get fish bait, you could get gasoline, and you could get various other necessities for a sandwich, or he did not serve any meals, but he had everything there that you could purchase for that, and fishing gear. You cross the creek and you come to Artesian Park. Artesian Park must have been there forever. I know that it had been, at times it was a wilder place than others. There's times it was not quite so wild. Everyone knew about Artesian Park, and as I had made mention as a youngster, I played in an orchestra after leaving high school, after graduating, and that was one of the haunts that we played at, and it was really the only nightclub in the area, should it be called a nightclub. There was taverns, but this was a nightclub, and they had dancing. I think between the 4 of us, we've covered all of the businesses that was in Herculaneum.
Well, all but one. We forgot Goose Caston, and I know most of you remember Goose Caston. He was a fisherman on the river, and Goose used to sell fish, and he was a character in his own right. But anyway, he lived down on the creek.
Elmo, what was the gentleman's name? Was it White that operated a ice and coal truck running out?
Oh, Preacher White.
Preacher White, okay. I recall his son, we were all much of the same age, I don't recall his name, and all of us youngsters at times in the summertime, we'd run along beside the truck trying to get him to chip us off a piece of ice.
Booze White.
But
Booze White, that's it. Yeah.
his son, he would always boast, he said, my father doesn't sell ice, he sells hard water. Okay. Okay.
Lillie, what kinds of transportation did you and your family have?
Well, far back as I can remember, we had a car, some kind of a little car. In fact, I think we had about one of the first cars in town because my dad was a very good friend of Mr. Dugan, and that's where he bought his car. And later on, especially during World War II and then through the Depression time, there was a jitney car that traveled back and forth from Festus and Crystal up to Herky, and you could go, and it had a regular schedule, and 3 or 4 times a day that bus would go back and forth from the Herculaneum and the Twin Cities. And then the Brown Bus Company came up from the south, farther south, and if we wanted to go to St. Louis, it would come through town. You would get your ticket down at Homer's at the drugstore, Honey Domar's drugstore. You buy your ticket, get on the Brown bus, and go to St. Louis, and it would take you all the way downtown. And many times, my sister and I especially would go up and spend all day Saturday downtown St. Louis shopping and just enjoying downtown St. Louis window shopping. And late in the evening, while we'd come home on the bus. And at one time I worked down at Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company in the duplex section where they made the glass for the airplanes for the war. And they had a jitney car. A man ran it back and forth to take all 3 shifts back and forth on that car. When he slept, I don't know, because he took every shift down, picked us up at our house, took us down to work, and then picked us up after work and took us home. And he did that for 3 shifts. And I think he split his sleeping in the car waiting for us. But that was our transportation, other than a lot of walking, whether it was down the highway to Festus or down the railroad tracks to Festus or up towards Peaford. We did do a lot of walking.
And Eddie, how did you get around?
I walked most places. I made a lot of trips between Herculaneum and Festus with my dad, especially on payday. We'd go over and celebrate a little bit. But over the years, we didn't have too much transportation in Herculaneum. Did a lot of walking.
Elmo, what about you?
Well, I remember when I was 12 years old, my dad had a pickup truck, and that's how we got it, because he was in business, of course. We'd see how fast we could come around that curve coming down Main Street, up there what we call Big Bug Hill, and that was that was up on the bluffs there where the superintendent of St. Joe lived, and then Harrods lived up there, and I can't think
Simpsons.
of a lot of different ones lived up there. Anyway, there's a real sharp curve, and that's still there. And of course, these were all gravel roads. They didn't have blacktop roads, you know. And we'd see how fast we'd go around that curve. We'd go around that sideways, you know, going like that, you know. Lucky there wasn't very many cars. Luckily, nobody met us on there. Then I remember when I was 13, me and my brother both, we drove what we call jitneys over to the shoe factory from Herculaneum to Festus. So Gardonigan had about 6 or 7 whippets. Now, a whippet is an automobile. They don't run too well or anything, and he usually tried to keep 4 in running condition, so he had to have about 8 in order to keep that, you know. But anyway, we'd deliver these ladies over to the shoe factory, my brother and I, when we were 12, 13 years old, and take these ladies to the shoe factory, and then after school we'd have to run and get them, bring them back. And that was their transportation to get to and from work. And we did a good service for them, you know. The whippets, so they'd break down nearly every trip, you know, you'd have trouble, it'd break down. But Gar had a lot of extra parts. He kept them in his living room, in his bedroom, and if you'd ever been in his house, you'd know that it didn't make any difference. That's about it.
Sonny, what kind of transportation did you have?
Could I make Blum back up and tell about his 28 Chevrolet?
Sure thing.
Blum had a 28 Chevrolet, him and his brother. Tell that story.
We got that Chevrolet, 28 Chevrolet. We paid $50 for that thing, and we painted it bright red. And that was when they had powder puff paint. In other words, you put the paint on with a powder puff, you know. Well, yeah, we liked that car. The girls loved it. Anytime that thing pulled up, you know, we had girls in that. And you know, we're just lucky that we didn't all get killed or something. But anyway, we had a lot of fun with that. Anyway, we sold it then. Finally, we sold it. This colored lady kept going down there and wanting to buy that thing from us, you know. And my dad had that service station in the garage. And so we asked him, he said, well, you boys do whatever you want to. So we sold it to her, got her $50 back, you know. She kept it about a month, and she come back and she said, them boys cheated me. And Pop said, well, what'd they do? And he said, they sold me a car that's got an engine with a bump in it. So he told us, he said, you boys go give her money back and get that car back. So we did. We gave her money back and got the car back, and we drove for quite a while. And I don't remember just exactly what happened to that old car, but we had a lot of fun in it.
Okay, Sonny, did
All
you
right,
have any
now.
stories of your own?
People in Herculaneum every household didn't have an automobile back during the time that I'm going to go back to. And the first vehicle that we had within our family was a Model T truck, a 1-ton truck. Now, it was a necessity in many ways. You could haul more things in a truck, especially if you had a 1-ton. At any rate, you've heard mention that there was a ferry and there's a road that did go down and paralleled the river. Well, in the fall of the year, my dad would go down with this Model T truck, and we would pick up driftwood of size and load this truck up. Now, it was a vintage and year that upon trying to drive back up the hill from the river, the gasoline being a gravity flow from the tank to the carburetor, you couldn't run forward up this hill, so it was necessary to turn the truck on. You could back up the hill and it would work. Okay. Besides using it in that manner, my dad also, it required that he would have to start off, let's say that he would choose, it would be in the fall of the year, and he would take the truck and drive over to Illinois, having to go through St. Louis, over to the Peabody Coal Company and get a ton of coal and bring it back. The next vehicle that I recall was an old Dodge, I think somewhere around 34, a 34 Dodge. Ran very well. We used it sparingly. You walked most of the time. Then, as time went on, I can recall that we came into a 36 Ford, and that was quite an eye. Henry had a V8, you know. That was quite, it was an eye catcher. It had that green color. Of course, I was too young to drive, but you know, I found that I could take a quarter and I could reach up underneath the lockout switch that was on the column. I could put that quarter under there and it would short the wires out. I could start the engine, but I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't steer it. Here I was, you know, like 12, 13 years old, but it was a very nice vehicle. We kept it for a long number of years. The next vehicles that I recall that we got into at about the 40s, and they were of the modern vintage. But speaking of automobiles and vehicles, let's go back and talk about the vehicles and the time during World War II when gasoline was rationed. Across the street or highway from where I lived was the Drennan family. And the Drennan family, Mr. Drennan knew how to work us boys. He could keep us in control. He put in quite a woodworking shop in back of his operation, in back of the house. But also, though, he did buy a wrecked vehicle. I mistakenly thought it was a 5-passenger coupe Mercury, but it was a Lincoln. It was a 12-cylinder vehicle. And it was during the time of war, and 12 cylinders. First, let's talk about these boys, his 2 sons and myself. This vehicle was bent everywhere. We got in there and we devised more means and more ways to twist and pull this vehicle back into shape. And Jesse Drennan was his oldest son. Jesse, he was quite a craftsman. And in the overall, we got this vehicle up to where it ran good and it looked good. Well, tires were rationed. Tires on this vehicle was poor. Gasoline was rationed. You couldn't go very far. You had to have gasoline stamps to even buy gasoline. It was really rationed. Well, you would buy, beg, borrow, and steal everything you could in the way of the family. Come on, can't somebody come up here? We were teenage boys, and we wanted to go to the basketball games at Festus and down to DeSoto. So Mr. Drennan, being in tune with how to keep us boys busy, he says, I'll tell you what, he says, I'll get a set of plans and we'll build a preheater and we'll put we'll put a tank in the trunk and we'll run kerosene. We'll put the shutoff valves in such a way. You'll start the car on gasoline, and after operating and getting up to an operating temperature, you'll turn on the kerosene and turn off the gasoline. We had far more stamps to buy kerosene than gasoline. This was a fun vehicle. We ran around. You would have flat tires. We always had 2 or 3 spares in the back. But it was fun, and it was a flashy automobile. And many times we would spend the whole weekend, though. You had to take the plugs out and clean them often because kerosene does carbon up your plugs. But speaking of automobiles, there wasn't a lot of automobiles in Herculaneum during the 30s. They started showing up, though, during the 40s. And then after that, it was gangbusters.
What was your fondest memory of Herculaneum?
Well, I think I enjoyed our church, our Baptist church I went to. We had a lot of youth in that church. And our main entertainment there was we would have, it was a youth group that included the boys and the girls. And we'd have parties, sometimes at each other's house, or we'd have a party at the church, or we'd go on just to wiener roasts, marshmallows, go down to the river and have a little picnic. And we did a lot of walking for fun. A lot of our walking was for fun. I remember we even walked all the way, one time from where I lived down in the lower part of town, up to the top of the hill, as far as Peevely. And we had what they called it there, a flower, almost like a flower garden. There was so many wildflowers up there. And we would, Sunday that was a treat to go up there and just see the pretty flowers and just walk with your friends. And maybe end up down at the drugstore having a glass of soda or maybe a little dish of ice cream. But there wasn't, we had games that we played out on the street. And of course, girls always had their little craft things that they could do. Visit each other's house and play with what toys they had. But toys were scarce among the children, but those that had toys was shared with each other. So we had plenty of things to keep us entertained. We didn't have to go out and look for problems.
Eddie, what about you?
Well, I think some of my fondest memories are working in the garden with my dad over at the river during the Depression years where food was hard to come by, and so we put in a garden over there. Our whole community went over and cleaned off this island and put gardens in over there. And I think that's some of my fond memories.
What's your fondest memory?
Well, I guess probably some of the fondest memories is some of the older guys in town. They kind of played jokes on my brother and I all the time, you know. They thought it was funny. And but we enjoyed being around those guys. And another fond memory was playing on the creek. We had an old boat. I remember one time somebody stole that boat. Well, of course, you didn't tie him up or anything. You just pulled it up on the bank when you wasn't using it. And we went down there to get in it one day, and it wasn't there. And so we got to inquiring around, found out where it was, and so we went and asked the guy for the boat back, and he said, "No, I found the boat. It's mine. Your name wasn't on it, so it's mine, you know." So we come back there, and Alonzo Carr was always hanging around there, and he was the deputy sheriff. I think he was the only deputy sheriff in town. J.W. Dugan was the main guy, but Alonzo Carr was too. Alonzo said, "I'll go get that boat for you boys." So he come back with the boat. I don't know what he did, but we had a lot of fun on the creek. We'd fall out of the boat once in a while. Well, really, we'd get into a fight, and one of us would knock the other one out of the boat. And we particularly liked that, you know, when it rained and that water would be coming down there, you know, real fast and swirling and everything. We'd like to get out in the middle of that thing and let that boat just let it loose and let it go, and that was a lot of fun. Things like that. My mother and dad would have had a fit if they'd known we were doing that, but they didn't know it.
Sonny, what about you?
Fondest memories. Let me go on record as saying that Herculaneum was a very fun place to have grown up during the time that I grew up in Herculaneum. There's so many things that we participated in. Every young lad carried a pocket knife from the time he was in 3rd grade, and it was a moment of fondness. We all had pocket knives, but we made many things for our own entertainment, among which was, did you know what a bean shooter was? That you take a fork of a tree and you whittle her down, and now you've got a crutch. You take that and you cut ribbons of rubber out of an inner tube, and you tie these on in a manner. Then out of your brogan shoes that you wore in the winter, you always saved the tongue out of that shoe, because that's what you made the pocket for this bean shooter out of. And Herculaneum had an abundance of slag that came from St. Joe Bed Company. And most of the boys you would see in the summertime, they'd have these bean shooters around the neck. And any time that you came to a place where Blum had gone around the corner and he had rolled some of this slag, you would sit and pick up and fill your pockets with all of this. Now, you would find that we would either be walking up and down the railroad track, lizards or snakes or anything that came along. If you've got 5 or 6 boys with these slingshots, whatever it was, it got killed, you know, so it was there. Up and down the creek, we did a similar sort of thing, and as Blum had pointed out, there was a number of boats always up and on the bank or tied up to the bank. No one locked anything up. This wasn't done. And also some of the more fonder memories was running with a bunch of boys, and we would go. Now you had to walk. We walked everywhere. And out at Sandy, where the road crossed Sandy Creek, we would walk from Herculaneum out to Sandy, and there was a swimming hole out there on what was Bage's farm. And it was really I guess the cleanest water that was in this part of the area. Most of the time it was clear. But every kid from the age of about 12 to 18 had an opportunity to go out there and learn to swim. And we did. And in a way, it was great fun. It was a sport. I would say that it would be difficult just to pick out any one thing, because growing up in Herculaneum was a lot of fun. It was. If you wasn't playing softball in the summer, you was sleigh riding in the winter. One of the things we didn't touch on was the Joachim Creek clears up in January and February. And it was great sport to go to the creek, and it would be at night. And you would form a type of reflector that you would put on the front of the boat. All of these boats had a flat front. And you would devise this reflector in such a way that you could hang a Coleman lantern on just inside of. And you would stand up on the front of this boat, on the front seat, and we gigged fish. And this gig would be a three-pronged gig, and it would be maybe 4, 5, 6 inches across. It wasn't a frog gig, it was a fish gig. And it would have a handle in it that would be anywhere from 10, 12 feet long. And it took 2 people to operate to go gigging. One guy would have to sit in the back of the boat and very slowly just paddle, very slowly. And you that was doing the gigging would be looking down in the water. The reflector kept the light away from your eyes. And you had a tub that was in the middle of the boat. You kept that in the middle of the boat. And anything that you would happen to think that you wanted to gig, you would. And you would bring it around, and the guy in back had to pull the fish off and put it in the tub. Now this same gig, though, you would put a piece of a clothesline on it. And if you seen something and the water or the boat wasn't in cooperation, we would even throw this gig. Sometimes you'd get a fish, sometimes you wouldn't. But it would be difficult just to identify any one thing. I want to say that for my part, it was an absolute pleasure growing up in Herculaneum.
And last but not least, what do y'all think the population of Herculaneum was when you were around?
It was 1,800 people.
Not so good.
So it said in the newspaper in 1947.
I see. Well, thank you all for coming today, and it was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.